Hello, everyone, and welcome into our second week of our psychoeducation group on grief. I really appreciate you joining in tonight, whether you're live with us right now or you're watching this later. Really do appreciate you joining. Uh, Last week, we started off by looking at the basically just grief in general. It was an overview of grief. We looked at defining grief, those emotions, feelings, behaviors tied to the loss of something important. Then we looked at some misconceptions about grief, some ideas out there about grief that really aren't right, but they kind of prevail in our minds. We looked at those misconceptions. Then we looked at the different types of grief. There's not just one type of grief. There's multiple types of grief that people can fall into. And so that's what we looked at last week. And if you have not seen that video, I encourage you to go back and watch that or share it with somebody who may need to see that. But that's kind of where we started. And tonight, we want to continue talking about grief in a different way here by looking at the stages of grief. So that's what we're going to be looking at here tonight, and presentations now before you. The stages of grief. So several people over the years have um, proposed these models for the stages that people move through as they grieve, through the grieving process. So if you type in just stages of grief online, you're likely to find tons of articles, and there's some that have 5 steps, 5 stages, or 5 steps. Some have 7 stages, some have just a few. There's a lot of different models that people have proposed. Again, it's just people have identified the common things, stages, or steps people go through as they grieve. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, are these stages that people kind of pass through as they grieve, as they've lost something. What do we move through? And that's what we want to look at here tonight. So probably the most famous model for these stages of grief is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I may be saying her name wrong. We're going to talk about her a lot tonight. It'll come up on a screen. I believe she's like a Swiss American psychologist. But years and years ago, she came up with these stages of grief. And I'm going to show you a quote here in just a second. And the quote is, in context, it is about Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. But I think it really can apply to any model that's been proposed about these stages of grief. But technically, in context, it is about Kubler-Ross's grief stages. But I wanted to say, like I said last week, and that's really what this quote's going to be about. I tried to hammer this home last week, that there is no like neat way of grieving. There is no one way of grieving. Everybody's process is different. And just because we say that there are stages of grief does not mean that you're going to go through the stages of grief like somebody else will, or that once you accomplish one stage of grief, it doesn't mean that you're done with it forever. You might fall back into another stage. So it's not just this neat, tidy thing that, and I don't want anyone to think that we're trying to fit anybody into a box with these grief stages, because grief is a tough process. And so I really appreciated this quote from it's actually on Southern Illinois University Edwardsville's website. They say this: the stages, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages, have evolved since their introduction, and they have been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Our grief is as individual as our very lives. The 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, are a part of the framework that makes up our learning to live with the one we lost. They are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling, but they are not stops on some linear timeline in grief. Not everyone goes through all of them or in a prescribed order. Our hope is that with these stages comes the knowledge of grief's terrain, making us better equipped to cope with life and loss. I thought that was probably one of the best things that I ran across in studying for this week's um, session here. Just an awesome quote. I think just perfect. My favorite line, I think, is the line that says, "There's not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss." You know, folks, there is no typical loss. When someone loses something important to them, like a loved one or a job, that's not something typical, right? It may happen to millions of people, right? People lose loved ones, but it's not easy. It's not just a normal thing. Yes, it happens to a lot of people, but loss is it's difficult, and it varies from person to person what it looks like, and so every single loss is that someone experiences. It's important and it's hard and it's difficult, but it's different for every single person how they handle it and how they go through these stages and their feelings. And so I really liked what this quote was basically trying to say, that these stages are not meant to like try to tuck these emotions, these messy emotions up into these neat packages, right? They're just ways of trying to understand grief. It's a framework of learning to cope with what we've lost. That's really what we're looking at with these stages. And again, some people don't even get through all the stages. Some people get through the stages and then fall back into some of the previous stages. So it's not just this linear progression all the time. But I thought this quote was just perfect. Really summed up this session tonight really, really well. Everyone's loss is individual to them, and so every response, there's going to be some similarities. There's also going to be differences. So please don't think that these stages are just things that okay, I've got to do this, or I've got to get to this area, or I've got to move through it like somebody else did. You can move through it how you move through it. It's going to be different for everybody. Okay. So this is what I said. This is Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Again, I may be saying this completely wrong. I don't know. Maybe I should have looked up the pronunciation of her name. But here's her stages of grief. We're going to go over those first here tonight. Her stages are: first, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Let's talk about each of these very quickly. Number one, denial. In this stage, it's characterized by a feeling of shock and denial from the loss, and an inability to come to terms with the loss. And this, honestly, folks, it's normal, right? This is normal to have some denial, to being very shocked about it and denying what has happened. Like typically in these instances, it's kind of like you lose. For instance, the easiest example is just the loss of a loved one. Someone loses someone important to them, and it's kind of like this reality for them that no, that really didn't happen. Like they're really not gone, or no, I'm just gonna wake up and it's just it's just gonna be a bad dream, and they're gonna be here again. That's this stage. This is typically the first thing people feel after losing somebody or something, is to go through this stage of denial, shock and denial. Some separate shock and denial, and so some will say there's a stage of shock where it's like, I cannot believe that this happened. Like, did this really happen? And then denial, where it's okay, this didn't really happen. It's all a bad dream, or the person's gonna come back, or this thing is gonna come back. But here Kubler-Ross just kind of puts it together: shock and denial, and really not being able to come to terms with this actually happening. And so denial can actually serve an important purpose, because it can kind of give us this, I don't even know what the right word is for it, but basically this feel like it kind of lets our feelings catch up. Like we kind of deny that something bad has happened, and so we're able to kind of gear up to face what's coming next, right? I guess it's almost like maybe like a buffering zone for what's coming. I don't know if I'm explaining that great, but it's important that we don't stay in denial forever, right? Because what we need to eventually get to is this point of realizing, coming to terms with reality, that we really have lost something and that it's not the same anymore. But denial, it is an important stage, and a stage that many people go through. And again, it can serve an important purpose for a time. Um, Next would be anger. Anger is the next phase. And folks, we know what anger is, but this stage is characterized by feelings of anger, resentment, and bitterness due to the loss. And this makes sense, right? And some may say, well, this is a negative thing. Folks, when you lose something, I think it's a normal response to be angry, to be upset, to have resentment and bitterness built up, right? And resentment and bitterness could come from, well, why didn't this happen to somebody else? Or they're still happy over there with their lives while I'm over here like this, you know, and feeling angry that you had to lose something. Why did it have to be me? Anger, I think, is a very appropriate response to losing something important to you. In fact, if you're not angry, if you don't feel these, the bitterness and things like that, I feel like that would honestly be a bad thing, right? This is a normal thing to be angry, to be upset, to feel bitterness because you lost something important to you, right? Why wouldn't you be? So, and you need to give way to that, to understanding that it's okay to be angry because you've lost something so very near and dear to you. So that's the second stage, is you go from denial into, okay, this has happened. Now I'm angry. I may be resentful. I may be bitter. That's the next stage. The next one is bargaining. Bargaining. So you may move into a stage where you start basically running through these scenarios of what if, or if only, in your head to regain control or get back what you lost. So it's things like, man, what if I would have just done this? Or if only this, then I'll do this and get the person back. You kind of are starting to bargain, trying to get what you've lost back. And people who are religious, and maybe like, God, if you'll just bring them back to me. Notice the word if you'll just bring them back to me, then I will serve you for the rest of my life, or I'll make sure I'll never be rude to them again. So it's statements like what if, or if only I had been better, this wouldn't have happened. Or if only I could, do this again, then it would have never happened. You're trying to regain control, and trying to bargain to get back what you lost. So that's kind of the next stage here, is bargaining, these what if statements and if only statements. The next stage is depression, right? And this is characterized by a feeling of deep sadness and withdrawal due to the loss. So, again, this is normal. And I know a lot of people would say, well, I don't want to feel these feelings, and um, this shouldn't be happening. But folks, again, if you're not sad, if you're not withdrawing somewhat, then I feel like that's actually more of a problem, right? Um, it's okay to have feelings of sadness and to withdraw due to your loss, right? You've lost something important to you, and to feel sadness, to feel that deep emptiness, and withdraw from others and withdraw from life because of it. To me, that seems like a normal response. And again, you need to give way to that. Now, what I'm not saying is we need to stay there forever, right? Where we need to always feel sad and always withdraw. But we need to be able to give way to our feelings, and to experience them. And that's actually going to come here to play in just a few minutes. But this is the one of the stages of Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, is depression. So the next one, and this is our final stage, is acceptance. And so this stage is characterized by accepting the fact that the loss has taken place. You're coming to terms with it. You're getting a grip that this has happened, and you've kind of come to understand what it means for your life and what it's going to mean for you going forward. And so this is the place where people get to where they've accepted that the loss has happened, but also understand they can move on and carry this with them through their life. And here's the thing, folks, not everybody gets to this stage. It's hard, right? Not everyone's going to get there. Not everyone's going to make it to this point of accepting the loss, and it's a difficult thing to get to this point because you've lost something important to you. It's hard to get to the point where you integrate this loss into your life and you're able to move on while carrying it all with you. But those are the 5 stages. I hope I have it on the next slide, all 5 of them. Okay, I didn't. Those are the 7 stages we'll go over next. But here's the 5 stages one more time: denial, kind of that sense of this really didn't happen. It's all a bad dream. Anger, I'm upset about this loss. I am resentful about it, bitter. Bargaining, trying to get back. If only I could just get them back, then I would do this, something like that. Depression, fear, intense sadness, and then accepting it. This has happened, and I can move on while carrying this loss through my life. So those are the stages that Kubler-Ross came up with. And again, these are probably the most well-known stages of grief, that the ones by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Um, so now there's 7 stages of grief. So some have adapted Kubler-Ross's 5 stages, and they've added a couple. And so again, I'll also say this: if you type in stages of grief, you're likely to find some that have more than 7 or less than 7, less than 5. But one you're going to find quite often is 7 stages of grief. And basically, some people have gone a little bit farther and just added a couple of stages onto Kubler-Ross's method and kind of changed up the terminology just a little bit. And so I want to show you these 7 stages as well. And then we'll go over one other one. Um, Here's the 7 stages of grief: shock and denial. We talked about with that with Kubler-Ross's model. Pain and guilt, that wasn't mentioned as much. We'll talk about that. Anger and bargaining, we just mentioned that in the previous slides. Depression, talked about that. We didn't really talk about the upward turn, the reconstruction and working through, or hope. We did talk about acceptance, but hope is kind of something added on. You can kind of see some similarities with Kubler-Ross's method and these 7 stages. So I won't go over the ones that we've already covered, like shock and denial, anger and bargaining, depression, those things. Let's just cover the ones that are on this list that are not, that we have not covered yet. So the first one would be pain and guilt. That second one within this 7 stages of grief. The first one, shock and denial, we went over that. It's kind of being, shocked that, wow, did this really happen? And no, it didn't. It's a denial that no, they're going to come back, or this is going to come back. Then the pain and guilt would be the second stage within the 7 stages of grief. And pain and guilt is feelings that the loss is unbearable, right? This deep feeling that I cannot make this through. That's the pain coming through. Like this loss is totally unbearable for me. I'm not going to get through this. And then guilt that you could have done more to prevent the loss, and I don't think a lot of people think about this, that you're making others' lives harder because of what you're going through. Folks, this has to be one of the hardest things for the grieving process, in my opinion. All of it is hard, but guilt, pain and guilt, this is really, really difficult, to feel that sense that this is too much for me, that this is unbearable. And then also feeling that guilt and just, I think it's normal, right? Just think about that, to feel guilt. Like I've heard people in the counseling room, say things like, if I just would have known, I could have prevented it. You know, I wish I would have been kinder to the person while they were living. And so people feel guilty for what they didn't do or what they did do before they lost a person or before they lost whatever it may be. And that eats away at you, right? But also the other side of guilt, that you may be hurting so much. You may be crying. You may be feeling desperate, and may be depressed, and you may call on people, or people may continue to come help you, and you may feel guilt, like, I'm so sorry for burdening you. Like, I feel like I'm such a weight on you now because of what I'm struggling through. And folks, here's the thing. I want you to know it's okay to struggle, right? When you lose something, it's normal to struggle, and people want to help, right? Most of the time, people want to help you. And so, um, I know it's normal to feel that guilt, and it's something that pops up for a lot of people. Um, but you're not a burden. You're not as much of a burden as you think. In many cases, you're really not a burden at all. It's just we're getting in our heads thinking, man, I'm overbearing people because of what I'm going through. But if people really care and they understand what loss is, they'll understand you're going through tough things, and it's okay, right? So, pain and guilt, it would be the next stage here. Anger and bargaining, we've already talked about that, those feelings of anger, resentment, bitterness because of the loss. Bargaining, trying to gain control back, or trying to win back what you've lost, even though you may not be able to. Depression, those feelings of sadness, and withdrawing from others and from life, really. But we have not talked about the upward turn. That would be the next one within these stages of grief. So the upward turn, they say, is this uh, heightened negative feelings have died down, and you're able to kind of return to a state of normalcy, or a calm, relaxed state. So basically, what they say here is that after some time of feeling these feelings of pain and guilt and anger and so on and so forth, those heightened negative feelings, they die down, and you're able to kind of return to a normal state, or a calm state, and you're trying to start to make this upward climb. Now, that's not to say that you might not step back down a little bit sometimes. That's not to say that those feelings have died down and you've dealt with them, that they'll never come up again. They might, right? They might come up again. um, this is just what a lot of people tend to do, is after some time of feeling these intense negative feelings, they're able to process it, work through it, and they're able to return to a calmer state, to a more relaxed state, and start to think about moving forward with their lives. That's the upward turn. The next one would be reconstruction and working through. That was not in Kubler-Ross's stages, but in the 7 stages of grief it is. And this is basically putting back the pieces of your life together, reconstructing your life, adapting to this loss that has happened, and moving forward. Now, that's not to say that reconstructing and working through means that you forget about what you've lost. Absolutely not. You're always going to remember that loss. You should remember the loss. You should carry it with you. It's just understanding that this has happened, and you're putting the pieces of your life back together. Although it's different, you're putting it back together, and you're moving forward while carrying what you've lost with you. That's the reconstruction and working through phase. Then acceptance and hope. We did talk about acceptance in Kubler-Ross's uh, method, but hope was not really mentioned there. So this would be accepting a new life and sensing a possibility for a good future, right? We've already talked about kind of coming to terms, accepting that the loss has happened. But this stage, some say, is that you also have a hope that the future is bright, that the future, that there is still something in store for me in the future. There's not all despair and hopelessness, that I'm never going to be able to make it through. No, I'm going to be able to make it through. There's a future there for me. Although it's going to be different, although it's going to maybe hard, there is still a good future for me. So those are the 7 stages of grief. I don't know if I put them back up here. No, I did not. We'll move into those other things here in just a second. But the 7 stages of grief, I guess I could just go back a couple of slides. Here they are: shock and denial, pain and guilt, anger and bargaining, depression, the upward turn, reconstruction and working through, acceptance and hope. Now, I want you to understand that This, again, I know I've said this, but I want to hammer this home. This does not follow a linear progression sometimes, right? Some people might have shock and denial and then go into depression, right? And then later have those the anger and bargaining stage, or they might overlap some, right? While you're in shock and denial, you may move into pain and guilt, but also have anger and bargaining at the same time. And then you might move into the upward turn, like we talked about a minute ago, and then the reconstruction and working through. But then you might start feeling those feelings of sadness in that depression stage. So it's not always just, okay, I'm getting better and it's always going to be up from here, right? But the hope is that you can get to the point of acceptance and hope where, yes, you may feel sad sometimes about the loss. You may feel angry about the loss sometimes, but you can still work through it and get to an understanding that this has happened, but I can carry it with me. And I'm always going to be, remember it. And I may be sad and angry at times, but I can still move through life and I can still go on carrying the loss with me. Um, so don't think that, okay, if I didn't get to this stage, or if I'm not there yet, what am I supposed to do? It's okay. It may take different time for you. You may have taken a little bit of a regression and gone back into one. It's okay. It's okay. You can get to the point of acceptance and hope at some point. Um, and you can work through the feelings as they come up. So those are the 7 stages of grief. Now, there was another model proposed by a man named William Worden. I believe his first name is William. I know his last name is Worden here. But he came up with what he calls the tasks of mourning. And so basically he said that there were different tasks. I know that this is a different word for than stages, but he came up with these tasks that people need to accomplish in order to come through a loss. Um, and so these are Warden's tasks of mourning. Number 1 is accept the reality of the loss. Number 2 would be processing the pain of grief. Number 3 is adjusting to a world without the deceased. And task 4 is finding an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. So these are Warden's tasks of mourning. Let's break these down real quick, and then we'll wrap this up here this evening. Task number 1 is accepting the reality of the loss. This task is basically kind of the opposite of denial and shock. So Worden does not say that you can't have denial or shock. In fact, that's an important thing, is feeling this sense of shock that, wow, has this really happened? No, it can't be true, right? But eventually working through that and getting to the point of accepting, no, this really has happened. The loss has taken place. And you understand this both psychologically, emotionally, on all levels. You understand that this loss has taken place, right? And why we say psychologically and emotionally here is that we may recognize, like, mentally, okay, this person's not here, or this thing I've lost, but our emotions haven't caught up yet, right? The way that we're handling it with our emotions is not gotten to the point of where we really, to where our mind is, like, we just recognize that the loss is there. Our emotions are still in that spot of really being in denial and shock. But acceptance of the reality of the loss, this first task, is actually coming to terms completely with the fact that this has happened. It's a reality that we've lost something. So that's that first task of mourning, according to Worden here. The second task is processing the pain of grief. So this is where feelings of grief are fully experienced and processed through. Here's the thing. Sometimes when people lose loved ones or lose something important to them, they may mask it. They may feel like they don't have the right to show their grief, or they want to maybe try to just push through it. Folks, a really important task of mourning is letting it happen, feeling the feelings, really experiencing what you're experiencing, really letting those feelings come through and processing through it as best as you can, and that's where a lot of times counseling can come in to help, is processing through these tough emotions. I have had so many clients tell me, not necessarily with loss, but just clients come in and say, just talking about this my week, and just talking about what's going on has been so helpful. And so that may be something important for you, is to come to counseling. And we here at Joanna Snow Ministries would love to see you, love to just process through your pain with you, process through your negative emotions, what you're feeling with you. And that's really what this task is all about, is coming to terms with, okay, I've got these negative feelings, and understanding it's okay to have these negative feelings. For some reason in our culture, I think there's this kind of stigma around having these negative feelings. And guys, it's okay to feel these negative feelings, and we need to experience them. We need to be aware that we're hurting, and aware of the things that we're feeling, and we need to process it, right? And just sit in it and allow ourselves to feel instead of masking it. Because if we try to mask it, or we try to just move on or not feel, we're not really addressing the underlying issues. We're not really moving through what we're feeling. So, processing the pain and grief, the pain of grief. This is task number 2. Task 3 is adjusting to a world without the deceased. So, this is kind of like the acceptance within the last couple models we've looked at. This would be navigating and adjusting to the changes that the loss has presented, right? So, this is again kind of coming to terms with the loss has happened. And in particular, it says, I know it says adjusting to a world without the deceased, but again, we could put things, other things in here, like losing a job, or losing something else important to you. It's navigating and adjusting to the changes the loss has presented. Folks, there is just no doubt that when you lose a loved one, when you lose a job, when you lose some type of object like your home or something like that, it's going to present a lot of changes, right? Again, an easy example is losing a loved one. You lose a spouse or a child or a grandparent who's been so instrumental in your life, who's been there for you, who you could talk to, and then all of a sudden it's gone, right? That's a big, big change. That's a big, big adjustment. And so Warden says that one of the tasks is adjusting, making these adjustments to this different reality. It's a different world. It's a different life now that this person or this thing has been taken away. And so it's learning to navigate and adjust to the changes this loss has presented, right? So um, if you've lost something, you know, think about the things that you've had to adjust to. Think about the things you've had to navigate. And Warden said this is one of the tasks is successfully adjusting to life without the deceased, or without the thing that you've lost. Task 4 is to find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. I know that's a lot of terminology, but simply put, we've kind of stated this already. It's basically carrying the memories of the loss while moving forward in life. It's finding your own special way of keeping that connection with who you've lost or what you've lost, while also having a new life. So, you may have some type of tradition or some type of memory that you carry with you, or some type of something like physical that you carry with you as you move on in life. But it's basically finding a way to carry what you've lost with you in the midst of embarking on this new life. And again, what I don't want anyone to get is that if you move on with your life, that does not mean that you forget about your loss. Absolutely not, right? Your loss, you don't forget about that loss, but you can move on with your life and keep that person with you, keep whatever you lost with you, keep those memories, keep those the fond connection that you had. You can keep that with you as you move forward, right? Moving forward, a lot of people feel guilty, and should have talked about that with guilt. It's like, if I move forward, that means I'm leaving them behind, or I'm forgetting. No, that's not what that means. You can move on in life and still carry on this loss, whatever you lost with you. And so those are the four tasks of mourning from Warden. And these four tasks are kind of similar to the other ones that we've talked about. It's just kind of a different way to frame it, right? And again, you may not move through these linearly in a linear fashion. I don't even know if linearly is a word. You may not move through these in a linear fashion, and some people may not get to the final task. So these are, generally speaking, though, the tasks that people go through or should go through as they grieve, as they mourn. Those are William Worden's tasks of mourning. Now, I wanted to say something real quickly before we wrap up here, and that's this. That's complicated grief. Right now, complicated grief is a prolonged and intense grief in which an individual is unable to adapt to the loss and continues to experience intense negative symptoms. Folks, it's a reality. I believe about 10% of people get into a place of complicated grief where they are unable to move through those stages. They're unable to move through those tasks, and they stay in this prolonged, drawn out, intense grief where the feelings of anger and bargaining, the feelings of resentment and depression, they last for a long, long time. Someone who in this spot is unable to come to terms with the loss, they're not able to adapt, navigate, like we just talked about a minute ago. They're not able to navigate and adjust to the loss, and they continue to experience these intense negative symptoms. That's complicated grief. It's almost like they're stuck in grief. And we looked at this last week. Remember, if you watched that last week, we talked about acute grief is kind of that. Acute grief is kind of the initial response to the loss. So, like, you lose a loved one. What are your immediate feelings, immediate thoughts, immediate behaviors? That's acute grief, right? What's your immediate response to what has happened? And many times it's things like shock and denial and sadness, right? That's acute grief. And some people are able to work through that and move through the different stages. Some, though, are not, and they kind of, it's almost like they stay in that acute grief where they're sad, they're shocked, they're denying. It's this prolonged, drawn out, intense grief in which someone cannot move through. So it's like experiencing that acute grief over and over, like it won't go away. And about 10% of people get to this point of complicated grief. And here's my suggestion: if you are in this place of complicated grief, or you know somebody who's in complicated grief, please, please see a counselor. Please work through this with somebody. Don't just continue to stay there. A counselor has the tools, has the abilities to help you through your grief. That is not, I'm not saying that a counselor is going to fix everything for you, fix your problems for you, because really, ultimately, we counselors, we don't fix people. We help people work through the things they have going in their lives. We try to help them facilitate change in their lives. And so, um, but a counselor, we do have the training, the tools to help with things like complicated grief. And so, if you find yourself in this situation, you know somebody in this situation, please send them our way, or get them to a mental health professional to try to help them work through this before it gets worse, right? Or before something drastic does happen. So, that's complicated grief. And I wanted to touch on that. I did touch on it last week. Let's look one more time now at Kubler-Ross's stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And again, if you go online and type these things in, you're probably likely to see Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. But then you're likely to see some people who have added on to those. You're likely to see other models that have different wording and different numbers of stages. But generally speaking, this is what you're going to see, or some form of this, something similar to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And I just want to reiterate one more time. I know you're probably tired of me saying this, but these things are not always linear. right? And it's not always like a pretty thing, meaning that it doesn't always look like somebody goes through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and then they're done, right? Some people may move through it differently. Some people may fall back sometimes. And some people, like we just said, move into complicated grief where they're unable to work through the stages and they're just unable to cope with the loss. And so please don't think that you have to fit into this box of stages of grief. Like that quote said at the beginning, everyone's process of grief is different because there is no normal grief. Everyone's process, everyone's loss is meaningful and different and difficult. And so you may move through stages differently. You may experience things differently than other people do. And that's okay. That's okay. So please understand that. I just wanted today to basically give everybody um, kind of the like that quote said, like a framework for what a lot of people experience in loss, what a lot of people go through as they lose somebody and as they are working through it. And I think it's a good thing to look at these stages to kind of help us frame, give us a framework of this of loss and what it may look like in many people's lives. But hey, I really, really appreciate you tuning in tonight. Thank you so much for your time. I want to reiterate, if you need counseling, please contact us here at Joanna Snow Ministries. We love to work with you. We love to work for you. We love to help you in any way possible. That's what we're here for. And I want you to know that if you are facing loss right now, we're here to support you. We're here to help. We're here to talk through it with you. And we want to do whatever we can to help people lead happy, healthy lives, and we'll do whatever we can to help you in that effort. So please contact us if you need counseling, not just for loss, but for anything. But I hope tonight was helpful. If it was, please share this with others, and hope you'll join us next week. We'll continue on with this grief psychoeducation group. Really appreciate you tuning in. Hope you have a great